an argument used, well, they could not have used atomic weapons because the atomic bomb was not invented until 1945. I have to scrap that argument completely. Again, I believe these people had more on them all. How many of you have heard that the Great Pyramid in Egypt could not be constructed by us in the modern world with our modern machinery? How many of you have heard that? 1, 2 3 of you? Yeah, okay. Maybe 4. All right. Hey, don't be bashful about it. I've heard it too. That the Japanese tried once to move a 50-ton rock. They couldn't do it. The rocks that make up the Great Pyramid weigh sometimes 50 and 60 tons. They were quarried 600 miles south. And they were moved from that quarry to the pyramid site with no evidence of a trail between. It's also believed the Stonehenge rocks were moved from Ireland to England, across the ocean, or a little bit of ocean. There was no wooden ships that could handle rocks that size. All right. Again, the point I'm trying to make, folk, is these people were not simple-minded primitives. If anyone is simple-minded primitive, we are compared to what they were. That mankind's tendency is to go down, 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 and only a few people have been able to reverse that and pull upward. Most people have gone throughout their history and gone down. All right, now, something else, a point I want to make. The Sumerians tried to spread their civilization through conquest. Conquest. Now, conquest was one time called a virtue. Today it's looked on as being evil. But the purpose of conquest was to, among other things, get the conquered people to raise up to a level of civilization to our level. In other words, we have a better civilization than they do. We want to transform these primitive peoples into civilized people. And they believed this justified their conquest. In the case of the United States, well, after Europe had conquered much of Africa, much of the Far East, and overtaken all of North and South America, the United States took the Philippines and took Cuba and took Puerto Rico, and the European nations pointed to the United States and said, naughty, naughty imperialists. Well, hey, we're doing what you've been doing. Oh, we quit doing that. We decided it's wrong. But conquest was once looked on being virtuous. Alexander the Great was a conqueror. Julius Caesar was a conqueror. Genghis Khan was a conqueror. Purpose was to, well, a lot of them, including Attila the Hun and Genghis Khan, believed that God had called them to take over. The Jews believed the same thing when they took over Canaan. But it was looked on as being a virtue. The first conqueror we know about was Sargon. Sargon was a Sumerian, and he built up an empire with the help of his god Enlil. And these people were extremely, extremely religious by our standards. They actually, again, believed that their gods had a physical presence in their temples. But, and the problem with these empires, one man would build it up, and then he would die and turn over to his son, and his son couldn't manage it. And the empire would totter. Sometimes the empire might last 2 or 3 generations. Now, in the case of Sargon, his empire lasted 3 generations, him, his son, and his grandson. When his grandson died, the empire fell apart. Again, I'm going to make the comparison. In my own lifetime, I saw an empire builder, named Oral Roberts. Got old and turned over to his son, and his son couldn't manage it. And his empire started to fall apart even before he died. Again, I don't know what you think about it, but this is one example where a lot of today's factory owners will build a huge, huge factory, and when they start to pass on, hey, my sons can't manage this, and I'll turn it over to a board of directors, because your sons can't manage it. McDonnell Douglas created the McDonnell Douglas Aircraft Corporation. 20 years ago, the last person named McDonnell, who was descended from the original McDonnell, his grandson, was laid off from McDonnell Douglas. The company no longer needed him. Again, typical, these empires were built, and because oftentimes these really, really high up people did not have sons who could manage, the empire would fall. Now this leads to another the concept of the dynasty. The word dynasty means rule by a family. We'll have a lot more to say about dynasties throughout the semester. The typical dynasty only lasts about 3 generations before it starts to crumble. Now, the present Queen of England, Queen Elizabeth II, can trace her lineage back to a king named Serdic who lived in the 400s, and he traced his back to Noah and the flood. Believe what you will. And the Japanese emperors traced theirs back to 600 BCE, 2,600 years, the longest dynasty known in history. I'll have more to say about that when we come to the lesson on Japan. But typically a dynasty only lasts about 3 or 4 generations. Now, after Sargon, the next one I want to mention, there were others, was Hammurabi. Hammurabi was a king of Babylon, the most famous city of that time period. In the case of Hammurabi, he started out with just Babylon. But then he conquered one city, got that city on his side, and used the armies of his own, plus that city he conquered, to go conquer another city. Got that city on his side and used the armies from the conquered cities and his own to conquer another city. And after 30 years, he had almost all of the land of Mesopotamia, Sumer and Akkad, conquered. Built himself up an empire, which lasted about 2 generations like the others. But Hammurabi is known for his law code, and your book shows some of his law code. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. If you knock out a person's eye, you must have your eye also knocked out. But it gave some leeway. If a man beat his servant and wounded his servant permanently, the master was not quite held to the same standard that the servant was. The masters were privileged. The rich were privileged. You can argue with that if you want to, but this was part of his law code also. A lot of persons believe that Moses copied part of his laws from the law code of Hammurabi, because there are some similarities. Anyway, Hammurabi's empire was overthrown by the Hittites a couple of generations after he went, and Babylon was to fall and not to rise again for 1,000 years. Then Babylon became powerful under King Nebuchadnezzar, and it outlasted Nebuchadnezzar by about 2 generations, and then it also fell more or less permanently. Babylon has made news in recent times. Saddam Hussein tried to rebuild the city. Unfortunately, he did not have the resources, and a lot of archaeologists were upset who said he's destroying the original. Folk, the thing about these stone and clay buildings, a lot of the ancients built their temples out of stone. The problem with them was they crumbled, and they were very, very difficult to repair. I mean, you take a building like this one. If the wall cracks, you get a workman in here, and he'll patch the seam up really good, and then put a coat of paint on it. You're not looking at the real walls, you're looking at the paint. Underneath the paint, there might be some cracks and there might be some imperfections, so they'll be glossed over by a nice coat of paint, and you'll notice. And of course, a building like this one, when it gets too old to fix anymore, they just get a wrecking ball and take it away and put a new one in its place. You get a stone temple. Once it's in place and starts to crumble, folk, there's no fixing it. And this was a problem with those old stone cities. Many a city we're going to talk about throughout the semester has been abandoned. because the stones started to crumble, the foundations started to get weak, and it became unsafe to live in the stone buildings, because they also, a lot of them had stone roofs. And you get a stone roof, if the foundation starts to crumble, you'd better get out and stay out. All right. Anyway, city of Babylon became a really beautiful city for a while, then it failed. Babylon was destined to rise, fall, rise again, and then fall, which is somewhat unique because a lot of times once these cities fell, they stayed fallen. All right. Now, something I must mention. Some years ago, I had my DNA tested, and that's how come I know that I'm related to the Cro-Magnon man. This was what they sent. This is from National Geographic. They wanted to trace everybody they could while we still had people, a lot of people living where they had originally dwelt. And in the modern world, I mean, people are moving from the original homes, and eventually they're going to intermarry with local people, and it's going to become harder and harder to trace them. But in 1986, there was a very, very interesting discovery made. By studying mitochondrial DNA, which is the DNA that females pass to their female offspring, as opposed to Y chromosome DNA. Y chromosome DNA is primarily, I know that there are instances where that mitochondrial DNA will pass from a mother to a son, and a Y chromosome might pass to a daughter. I mean, there might be some exceptions. I mean, we've learned a lot more about genetics since 1986, but one thing we proved in 1986 has not been disproven. They proved that all human females alive today are descended from one woman. When they then turned around and studied Y chromosome DNA, they made this somewhat shocking discovery that all human males living today are descended